Thanks everybody for coming along. I'm Dominic Byers, I'm the politics editor at one of the politics editors at OUP, and I'm delighted to introduce Patrick Porter, who is Professor of International Security and Strategy at Birmingham University. Delighted not just because he's the first of my authors that's actually bothered to come in and talk to us about all these things, but that's a bonus.
Not the last time.
Well, we'll see how it goes. Patrick's actually written an absolutely fascinating account of the shenanigans that led up to the UK's decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. One of the more divisive political decisions within the UK. I say that with kind of a scare quotes around given what's going on at the moment. One of the more divisive decisions in the UK politics of the last 40 years. And that's the book. Fantastic cover. I think we're going to probably talk about that a little bit anyway. Now, the definitive account of that decision is the Chilcot Report. But that's 2.6 million words. Now, Patrick's done a massive favour by writing 110,000 words of pacey narrative. It's a real page turner with some interesting conclusions, some really surprising conclusions, in fact. And I think he's going to speak a bit about that today. So we'll do about 20 minutes and then we'll do questions at the end. Do bombard him with questions. But let's give Patrick a warm OUP button.
Well, thank you so much, Dominic, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually stunned that you would sacrifice your lunch hours on the altar of this book, so I owe you a good performance. I wanted to start by talking about this very, I think, lovely front cover. I would say so myself, but OUP have generated this wonderful image, and a lot of people, when they see the front cover, they think, well, this is obviously going to be a polemic against Tony Blair. Actually, it's not. It's really a book about ideas. And my main thing really is that the Iraq War is a very ideological adventure, driven by ideas that are still with us, and ideas that were still in the public domain, long after the departure of people at the time, Tony Blair and all those people, George Bush, Colin Powell, Jack Straw, Claire Short, the whole cast of characters who you may recall, long after they've left the scene, still the ideas of regime change, of rogue states, of weapons of mass destruction. Revolutionary war, in fact, is still with us, and that's still in the air. The front cover shows obviously a very Aztec, just in case you can't see it, a very Aztec-faced Tony Blair at a commemoration service in early 2017 for all those who served in Afghanistan and Iraq. And actually, what sort of drew me to that wasn't just his expression, but the faces of the giggling grandees and dignitaries and royals around him, that for whatever else you want to say about Tony Blair, and the book is critical about some of his judgments, he at least takes this very seriously, and in a way he faces ahead, he faces the music. He actually comes and addresses this directly. He's ultimately unrepentant about his decision and his calculus about Iraq, but there is a certain ambivalence here about, well, I don't agree with him, but at least he's articulating a case and a narrative. The reason I wrote this was precisely I was a bit scared that a lot of people would want to forget it, or when they remember it, to just trivialise it as Tony Blair's war. Tony Blair's, I won't use that expression in front of the camera, Tony Blair's error, and that it's something in the past, that it stands alone. We're beyond all that now. There's other things to worry about. In fact, I'll say this with my wife present, I started writing this while I was on honeymoon. And it just so happened that we were away on a Greek island the week after the European referendum, because I'm sick of that B word. And I was a little bit scared that the Chilcot report was about to be released afterwards, and I was concerned that Brexit would devour everything. It would overshadow everything, it would suck the energy out of everything else. It turns out I was more right than I knew. And I wanted to sort of try and push back a little bit against that and talk about the importance of the national and international reckoning with one of the most significant foreign policy choice, I think, since Suez, at least in terms of military campaigns. Secondly, I was scared for another reason, that some others would want to remember it, particularly people who sort of weren't there, but want to remember it as a set of tactical lessons about how to do it right next time. So in other words, to almost trivialise the Iraq War as a kind of clinic in how to go around overthrowing regimes and democratising countries at the point of a gun and doing it better. And although that would also miss something about the profound nature of what was going on what I think a blunder. Now, why do I say blunder? A lot of people call it a crime, and that's that famous expression, I think, from the French, it was worse than a crime, it was a blunder. But my thing is, even if, let's say, the whole thing had been certified as legal and the whole United Nations had agreed with it and the Pope and the Dalai Lama had signed off on it and the whole of Britain had voted for it in a referendum, I still think it would have been a mistake. I think there was a miscalculation about it. A blunder means sort of careless error. But it's not just the way it's often talked about, that it's bad planning or bad technocratic thing. I think there's something about using war to overthrow governments that is inherently revolutionary and far more wildly risky than we give credit for. Now, I'm no pacifist. I would prepare quite hawkish military capabilities, just not use them very much. I think beyond defence and deterrence, war is very hard to make work. And so I just want to give you a brief summary of what I try and argue here, and that is that the Iraq War is ultimately not a cynical exercise in doing something unspeakable while giving it nice-sounding rhetoric. In fact, they meant it. And when I say they, it's not just Tony Blair. In fact, what I try and argue is that it's Britain's war, not just Blair's war. Multiple centres of decision sincerely believed that, for a number of rationales, this was the right judgment call. And we've done similar things on a lesser scale again and again afterwards, after going after regime change in Damascus, Libya, and now in America, Venezuela. So this thing keeps going and going. But it was the British Parliament, the Conservative Party, Rupert Murdoch, the Sun King, who was not subject to Tony Blair's whip. A large number of British people, when they were surveyed at the time from YouGov over the first year of the war, quiet majorities actually supported it. They weren't the loud ones, but there was a quiet agreement and consent that this was probably the right move. A lot of Iraqis, particularly in exile, agreed with the war. In fact, Tony Blair, when he was campaigning, went to Edinburgh, and a set of Iraqis who were representing the local community presented with a letter demanding regime change and denouncing the anti-war protests, saying no, that a democratic revolution was possible in Iraq and desirable. And there was, in other words, there was a very broad ownership of this decision, which is being now, I think, rewritten badly and irresponsibly and superficially as one man's obsession and one man's problem. And I think that is not only untrue, I think it's also very irresponsible. I think we have a responsibility to confront this issue because it's not just part of the past, it's part of the present, it's part of the debate we are still having about foreign policy. One of my students, in fact, psychologically diagnosed me and accused me of this being really a book about Brexit. I really hope not. That might just hurt the sales or help the sales, who knows. It's not that, but one thing I am sort of concerned about in the air at the moment, if there's one little parallel I would want to draw, not so much about the rights or wrongs of decision, but about the kind of atmosphere in which decisions are made. One thing you hear a lot, and we all say it, is we're sick of this thing. We're sick of this issue. Fatigue with an issue. We wish it would just, yes, it's important, but we wish the whole bloody thing, pardon my language, would just go away. Put it to bed, get on with it. There was quite a lot of that around the whole question of disarmament and Iraq and Saddam Hussein and the end game. And as well as it being about a matter of fear, post 9/11 world, fear of terrorism, fear of WMD, fear of rogue states, bringing those things together, and as much as it was all about a sense of power, because if you look at the arc of history from the end of the Cold War to 2003, an increasing optimism that war can work, and not just war to defend yourself or to deter attacks, but actually to go around and reordering whole regions. But also, as well as all that, there was this real strong sense that we're just sick of this misbehaving rogue maverick in Baghdad, who is at once a threat to us and is a pain in the arse. It's one of the people actually said to me, Saddam Hussein was a pain in the arse. And Donald Rumsfeld often, after 9/11, writes, sweep it all up. Sweep it, get rid of it, like it's a mosquito. So there is a kind of dangerousness to that boredom and that fatigue, which I've sort of noticed in the country at the moment. That's enough Brexit for now. There's another aspect of which is, I think, distinctively British, and that is a third part, as well as the sense of the dangerous rogue state, as well as the sense in which the path to security is to overthrow states. The third part was what we might call the blood price, the idea that Britain can secure special influence in Washington by bandwagoning or aligning itself with this American campaign. And that's actually quite an old idea in British statecraft, all the way back at least to the days of Harold Macmillan and the end of World War II, that Britain may no longer be a first-tier superpower, but it still has imperial knowledge. It still has expertise in power projection, in realpolitik, in running the world, and that it can advise and tutor the new superpower, America. And Bush's America inflamed and wounded and terrified by 9/11, that might go off the rails and start nuking people or take itself out of the international system or junk the United Nations. And the first reaction of the Blair government and many people after 9/11 is to be scared of America. And this belief that by joining in and by getting America to sign up to an international process of arms control and verification and inspection and escalation with Iraq, that at least Britain could tie America back in to the international system. I say, quite aside from that, there is a quite sincere fear about WMD, and I'd say a little bit more about that at the moment, but there's this bigger agenda which is quite explicit, which is this is about Britain's, not just its specialness, but its ability to steer this very powerful and potentially dangerous United States in the right direction. There is a certain condescension implicit in that. I'm not sure that your Harvard-educated PhD expert with 3 languages really does need Harvey Wilkinson from the FCA to tell him exactly what to do. But there was an authentic and quite responsible idea that what does this mean for the international system, and Britain trying to craft a responsible way through that. In fact, as you can probably hear from the tone of my voice, the biggest criticism I get about this book is that I'm too nice, in a way, to the people making these decisions. But I think if you're going to try and write a history of something, you have to try a little bit of empathy and imagine for just an afternoon that you might be wrong. So the way the whole book ends is that I show Tony Blair's speech on the eve of the war, and then I try and write an alternative speech he could have given if we weren't going in, and so that people can judge for themselves. Because if we're going to say that the whole thing is dogmatic, then we have to avoid our own dogmas and entertain the argument once again, because it's an argument we keep having. Last thing I'll say, because what's often mentioned as well is, what about the dossiers, what about the lies, what about the 45 minutes and all of that stuff? I think it's much worse in a way than people wanting to do something wicked and so therefore fabricating excuses. In a way that would be better because there's a certain control and a certain realism in that. What you have here rather is people deciding that they want to do this very ambitious thing, and there's a real ambition here in the White House and in London to reshape the Middle East as a pathway through Baghdad to a better and safer world. But there is minds already made up before assessing evidence, right? So it's self-delusion rather than just deluding others. And in the process of dealing with intelligence, which is ambiguous and can be interpreted in different ways, and in many respects weak and patchy, they've already made up their minds, and so they're placing unwarranted certitude on ambiguous evidence. But even if they'd realised and come face to face with the ambiguity of the evidence, they still believed it was the right thing to do because we didn't know, because Saddam Hussein had played cat and mouse. And there was a second logic, which was we can't take risks in the post-9/11 world. We have to get in first. There's a very brutal logic here. We've got to get them first. Tragically, what that does, of course, is to ignore the wild risks of breaking a state. And that's what we're talking about here, that after 9/11, Britain and America led an international coalition, including Australia, which was doing something they weren't realising they were doing, which was acting as Jacobins, which is radical revolutionary war, overthrowing regimes to reshape regions, to liberate them, and to do so for the net benefit of humanity. So it was much worse than a cynical exercise. It was a war of real idealism. And unfortunately, that's not part of our past, but that's an argument we need to have with ourselves rather than just saying rude things about Tony Blair and cheering waiters as they try and arrest him in restaurants. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to your questions and comments and complaints. Thank you. Cheers. Anyone? Yes?
So you mentioned the war in Iraq being sort of attempts to partly foster relations with the US. How would you evaluate the success of that?
So I think it's a dream that is actually inherently unworkable, because if you think about the logic, first of all, it's unrealistic about how America actually does things. America, I've got this night and day theory, which I talk about in the book, about how the United States is very sentimental in its rhetoric about the Anglo-American relationship by night, when they talk about the memory of World War II cooperation and the Cold War and Winston Churchill, an Anglo-American figure, and this real sense of mutual heroism. In fact, people love Winston Churchill in America more than they do in Britain. I was at a winery randomly in California a few years ago, and the guy in charge said, "I do hope you people still respect and admire and teach your children about Winston Churchill." There's real intensity in that. But by day, the United States does what it likes, because it's a great power. And the whole point of America, particularly this great power, is not to do what Britain tells it. That's kind of the idea of 1783. But what's also a problem is that the very logic of aligning with America to influence it is in a way contradictory, I think, because you're saying we've got to acquiesce at the critical hour of controversy in order to have influence, which means you wouldn't dare test or exercise that influence for fear of losing it. So it becomes this silent influence. And what actually happens on the ground, and there was a leaked report from the army, which was actually in the military campaigning where they were trying to really exercise influence. There was some around the edges and some stuff to do with the United Nations as well, but the general wording of the internal report that got leaked was the train was at Grand Central and it was going and we were on it, but we couldn't change the direction. It was sort of underway. So, and particularly Bush's America in that moment was particularly unwilling to be constrained, except around the edges. That doesn't mean, this is not a vulgar, I mean there is too much vulgar anti-Americanism around. It doesn't mean you therefore as a point resist America no matter what they do. Of course you assess it on the merits. I mean one of the problems is Britain, and I'm allowed to say we because I've got my passport, we place a very heavy burden on ourselves. If you're Australia or if you're Canada, you just seek mutual benefit, some transactions and bargaining, hopefully stay friends. In Britain you can't just be friends. There's something about specialness here. There's something very, a real burden of having been the great power and wanting to have more than anybody else. Hence the ritual that happens every time there's a new American president. Did he call our Prime Minister first before the Chancellor of Germany? And I think all of that is a huge burden which gets in the way of, we need some actually a bit colder decision making. And occasionally, if you want to influence America, you've got to actually shout at them, like Margaret Thatcher used to do. Anyway, that's another story. Sorry, long answer. Yeah?
Do you think we'd be having these conversations if, so the war, the actual invasion was a success,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was afterwards when we lost the peace, where
Right.
everything went horribly wrong, things like debarkification and
Mm-hmm.
stupid things like that.
Yeah.
If we hadn't done that, if we'd won the peace and Iraq was now a successful nation,
Yes.
would we be having these conversations?
I think we probably wouldn't. I think that, that is one of the critiques, which I sort of disagree with in the book, is the idea that the actual 3-week war in itself is very well run. It results in the overthrow of a regime in Baghdad that could have actually held on for much longer. A lot of warnings from the anti-war movement was this could be a terrible bloodbath and there could be Fortress Baghdad, and actually that doesn't happen. And the mistake comes in the mismanagement of the post-Saddam Iraq afterwards. I disagree with that for a few reasons. First of all, I think there was something inherent in Ba'ath Iraq which was going to explode, particularly under the stress of occupation. Not just because of errors by the occupier, but because of Iraqi's own politics. If you look at the record of the meeting between Paul Bremer III, who was the American regent in a way, head of the occupation authority, negotiating with the Iraqi political parties, opposition parties, etc., particularly the Shia parties and the Kurds, whilst America did have an idea that they were going to kind of denazify Iraq, like West Germany had, with the debartification program and the army and the civil service, the momentum was actually coming very strongly from below. That there was a fear amongst the Shia and the Kurds that America would actually turn up and just install another Saddam, or install Sunni supremacism over them, and it would be meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So in other words, there's a really tragic dilemma here. Either America does very little, has minimal institutional impact, prefers stability, just cuts off the head but keeps the rest of the Ba'ath party there with the Sunnis, and then you have a great resistance from the Shia and the Kurds, or it does what it did do, which is to go along with debartification and then be shocked at the level and depth of which people, just school teachers, people just running the sewers are being fired. Anyone who's just got a Ba'ath party card in their pocket is being fired, which helps to bring about chaos. But I think there is a real dilemma there where as soon as we kicked in the door, we were due in for strife. Now, there's some other things that happen as well. One of the reasons Iraq, I think, is very difficult to have what you say, a kind of a victorious, stable thing, is geography. That you've got a very naughty regime in Syria, sponsoring jihadis coming across the border. I mean, Assad, much as I'm a skeptic on intervening in Syria, Assad is a bankroller and supporter of jihadi terrorists, putting them into Iraq in order to bleed the occupation, right? And then you have, of course, something which hardly mentioned in the British debate leading up to it, Iran. If you go through the parliamentary debate, right, on what they're talking about, when they do talk about the region, they're talking mostly about Israel and Palestine, right? That's the kind of, particularly, and not just in the parliament, but on the sort of the anti-war left, a lot of discussions about Israel and Palestine and that sort of thing. But actually, it's Iran that is one of the great beneficiaries of this war, that it overthrows some of the balance in the Gulf. And Iran has huge ties to Shia militias, Shia political parties, Shia clerics, and a lot of those very, people call them improvised explosive devices, actually pretty military-grade explosive devices coming across the border from Iran. So you've got spoilers who are sitting there not wanting this to be this stable, smooth transition under American occupation, but wanting this to be expensive and difficult and bloody. So the very fact that Iraq is sitting there amidst that geopolitical vortex makes this very hard. But quite aside from the specificities of Iraq, I think there is something about, not always, but a lot, about breaking and remaking states that is much more difficult than we give it credit for. I think military force can, in fact, work very effectively, right? Absolutely. Gulf War I, the Falklands, there are cases where military force can be brought to bear very realistically. But when you're in the business of actually creating, reconstituting whole states, except in certain kinds of circumstances, it's very hard to get right. Yeah, so we do need to be careful of those moments, and also when war seems to work, which it has seemed to work in the past, not to then necessarily generalise that therefore it always works, which is what I think some MPs got carried away with. We've found out from Bosnia and Iraq in Gulf War I and the Falklands that righteous military action with determined leadership can work. Well, under certain circumstances. But other circumstances, it gets a bit more difficult. That's where I come out. Yes?
Yeah, so it's almost the idea that, you know, the sort of winning the peace is unwinnable, that you can't, that you release forces that you can't control, and only very rarely does it ever seem to work. It doesn't surprise me that neoliberal American nutters would expect that to be the thing they can get around that. What does surprise me that Tony Blair bought into that idea, because it seems, well, a lesson of history, that it just doesn't work. You know, as you say, military occupation, or rather military strike, get rid of the government and let the people come together and form, you know, a better world. But you know, especially in the Middle East, where the countries themselves were formed by the West out of where there's ethnic diversity, where there was no sense of nation beforehand.
Yep.
And a lot of the time, people like Saddam managed to make Iraq work by suppressing those forces. And so when you remove the oppressive leader, those forces then come to back to haunt you. And the same was even true in Yugoslavia, let alone, you know, elsewhere. Syria is another example where there are, you know, ethnic conflicts have been magnified by removing the sort of suppressive forces that existed to hold them back in the first place.
Gosh, so some very important points there. So the first thing I'd say, and I should have mentioned this, is this, without being too pretentious, this book is partly a self-reproach. I used to be a big believer as well. Maybe I was a nutter then. But in the sense, we can all be very easily nutters in believing what we want to believe. I used to be a bit of a paid-up neoconservative believer. Once that statue came down of Iraq and the kind of sense of possibility, and then raises the question, what are the lessons of history? For a lot of the makers of war in 2003, the lesson of history was Munich and Chamberlain and Hitler, and the possibility of not just waging a good, righteous war, but then having a stable West German type, or Japan type, or South Korea type aftermath. And Paul Wolfowitz actually wrote an article saying that Iraq's going to be the new South Korea of the Gulf. So people are picking different kinds of analogies and different lessons with all the assumptions built in. So actually, in a way, it's worse than what you say, because these are smart people buying into very ambitious ideas. That wasn't saying I'm smart, but these characters. And what's also important here is that a lot of people have scrambled to rewrite the history as, yes, a few fanatics in Downing Street, when actually they themselves voted that war would work. Gordon Brown recently has discovered that after all, he would have voted against this if he'd known about an undiscussed, undisclosed intelligence report lurking somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, which casts some doubt upon the evidence. I don't think that's what happened in 2003. I think he and the very large number of MPs and people who supported them, they made a decision not just about intelligence. Well, it wasn't just about intelligence. Even if Saddam has got chemical weapons, is it prudent to invade the country is the question. They voted that war would work. It is that calculation that was at the heart of the thing, and not just dossiers and all of the rumours and all the other stuff, which we get a bit too carried away with sometimes. Why did they think war would work? They'd come out of a period where there was increasing confidence in the West about what war could do. A succession of campaigns. And don't forget, in 2001, 2002, it looks like Afghanistan's a success. The graveyard of empires, the one that no one's supposed to go into. You know the old lessons from sort of year 10 history? Don't ever invade Russia, don't invade Afghanistan, and the side with the elephants loses. Right? So if we can get it right in Afghanistan, then we've got these middle-class Iraqis like Ahmad Chalabi telling us that it can work in Baghdad, and why not? So the point is, it's very easy you can see the logic here and how it worked at the time. So what delusions are we entertaining now, either on that side or on the other side, that are wrong, is the question. So the point is, a lot of very sane people can fall prey to what they want to believe, and that's one of the cautions here, I think. Yeah.
Talk about evidence.
Yeah.
Does your book touch on when today occurred?
It doesn't. I mean, I think that doesn't mean it's not an important issue. It's an important issue, and it's to do with how the government handles dissent and intelligence, and that really matters. The reason I don't really talk about that is it's not a huge amount to do with why Britain makes the decision that it makes, and it's a very important issue to do with the war, but I don't see it as being a fundamental causal sort of driver. Do I have anything to say about that that's original? No, I don't. I think that they were certainly quite authoritarian days, and the attempt to control information and to register for dissent. But what's also important there is that the Kelly affair, as you may remember it got everyone talking narrowly and narrowly about WMD, not about the broader picture here, right? So we know that Saddam Hussein doesn't yet have a deliverable nuclear bomb. He probably has some chemical weapons. He actually didn't. But let's say Saddam Hussein has had chemical weapons for 15 years. Why, since Gulf War I, hasn't he used them on us then, if he's this lunatic, if he's this unstable, aggressive dictator? Maybe we can deter him. Those kind of questions not being properly addressed. Instead, it becomes this kind of much more narrow forensic discussion about whether we've got battlefield or strategic weapons with a 45 minutes notice, which becomes a way almost of avoiding the deeper politics of the war. Yeah.
So two things. How far do you think 9/11 was the main influence in going into the war in Iraq? Was it used as an opportunistic device?
Yeah.
And second, do you think because the actual, I suppose, like you said, the actual failure of the invasion wasn't the conquering itself, it was the aftermath. And do you think that we just, even if the intentions were good to try and instigate the peace process within the Middle East, do you think it just wasn't thought out about how exactly are we going to do it once we achieve the victory?
So a lot of people would agree with you. A lot of people would say, actually, this is a problem of implementation, not the decision itself. It's how well you do it. It's sort of an administrative and almost colonial reading here, the idea that the Iraqis needed to be better administered into capitalist democracy by the well-meaning occupiers who needed a better plan. Quite a lot of people from the development department talked to me about this in this way. They weren't in favour of the war, but it's a very kind of administrative thing. I don't agree with that, because Iraqi politics is in a different state where the Iraqis want different things, and there is a basic misalignment between the interests of the occupier and the political interests of those who wield power in Iraq. It's not that Iraqis all want to get into some terrible civil war, but they have rational reasons to be frightened of one another. They've lived under a divide and rule dictatorship. They have very strong reasons to be suspicious once that Leviathan Saddam Hussein is removed. And even voting becomes a dangerous competition for winner-takes-all power. I don't think you can engineer your way out of that with a good administrative plan. I think there's something much more deep there about the state of Iraqi politics. That's not to say that non-Westerners non-white people can't become capitalist democracies. Of course they can. The conceit is to suppose that they could do it at our way, at our timetable, when we choose and when we say so. And the world is not a convenient place like that. And we have to give a lot of credit to Iraqi agency, but also responsibility. Iraqis chose a number of things under very difficult conditions. On the 9/11 point, that's really important, a really important event, because 9/11 is the event that raises fear to the sufficient level where the US is willing to take a few thousand casualties when they weren't before 9/11. If nothing else, it's that risk appetite or that cost appetite that goes up. It's also important because the way it's read as revealing how dangerous the globalised world is, right? It's that 9/11 shows what can happen when you get very predatory ideas with dangerous weapons, and imagine that could be exponentially worse if similar people had chemical or biological or nuclear weapons. So that's the ultimate nightmare, and the sum of all fears is the idea that someone like Saddam will transfer WebWMD to a terrorist group. That's the very precise threat picture that does haunt them. And if you're in government, the fear is, what if that happens and it happens on my watch and I'm responsible and I'm held responsible? So it seems more cautious to wage war than not to wage war. That becomes this sort of that very real thing that does haunt them. And I think there are some problems with the whole idea of rogue states who are supposed to be mad rationally giving WMD to a terrorist group in order to evade punishment. That's quite a sane. There's a sort of rationality in that which suggests they do understand deterrence and punishment, which means you probably can live with them. But that's another story that you can all read about at leisure. Yes, Jen, the back, yeah.
Can you tell me, so given the sophistication of Blair's PR machine,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just fascinated to know, why has he become the scapegoat for all of this? Because like you say, there's
Yeah.
clearly a lot of consent around going to war, and yet
Yeah.
Blair constantly bashed for this decision that was not his and his alone.
Indeed.
And I'd just love to unpick, because I can't imagine Anthony Cannibal being somebody that wouldn't handle this sort of situation but in a very sophisticated manner. So I struggle to understand
Yeah.
that intense hatred of Blair, which I think is unjustified.
And it is very strong. I mean, it is a dinner party ruining.
Yeah.
So
I mean, did any other leader who went to war, they have this same sort of...
nothing like the same venom.
No, and I'm just fascinated to know why.
John Howard a bit in Australia, but nothing like Blair. So, great question. Explaining hatred of Tony Blair, it's partly, I think, it's when people, not everybody, but when they see him talking on TV and they decide they hate him, it's because he reminds them they used to agree with him. And it threatens to turn attention on their own historical support. A lot of people supported the New Labour project agreeing that they had solved boom and bust economics. That was a regular claim and a lot of people bought into it. There was a lot of support, and actually life for quite a lot of people seemed to get better under New Labour. And the whole argument now about, and this is a very important part of the history of the Labour Party too, by the way, but there is this kind of resentment that they used to be part of this. And I think that's it's very psychologically easier to rethink this history as one where they were hoodwinked and charmed by the silver-tongued lying Blair into something they otherwise wouldn't have done, right? So there's a kind of basic irresponsibility about it. I also have a bit of a go at the anti-war movement, actually, in the book. Not every member of the anti-war movement, but the way in which they, I think, missed an opportunity to have a more sophisticated argument, because their slogan was "not in my name." There's a real hand-washing in that. Not me, it's you. I'm not going to be responsible here. This is not a responsible democracy. This is your decision on your head. I think there's something very, it misses the chance to actually get stuck in and have the hard arguments. And I remember at the time thinking, well, at least Blair and Bush are making the arguments and not just saying oil and liar and killing children and all the kind of boilerplate cliches from the hippie sort of anti-war movement of Vietnam. There's actually a real thing going on here. There were, of course, exceptions to that, but one of the reasons Blair is framed that way is that the anti-war movement have a very personalised depiction of this as Blair and Bush and kind of killing children and everything. But it's also reinforced accidentally by Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell, who present everything in very personal terms. Blair says, "I do not repent of my decision," and he did govern in a very presidential way, and he did meet with his advisors in what he called the den to make some big decisions. I mean, I think this still goes to the Parliament, it still becomes a national decision. So Blair unintentionally reinforces that very biographical thing, it's all about him and everybody. Once it all starts going wrong, of course they lose control of that. So, yes?
Just a short question, really. What do you think Tony Blair would think of your book?
Someone said to me that, John Bew said to me, what do you think? Do you think Tony Blair will read it? I said, well, I'm sure it'll be read for him. I think honestly, I think he would half hate it and half think it's not bad. He'd hate it because he just disagrees with the argument, and occasionally, I guess, the criticism is robust in the book. On the other hand, I do try and make an effort, whether that's any good or not is up to the reader, to try and empathise with the decision makers at the time and say that actually we've got to face the arguments here, and you can't just dismiss the whole thing. That needs to be taken seriously. The people who are making the decisions are serious actors with real, genuine motives, and they're not just cardboard cutout villains. And so maybe he'd like that. I'm dying for him to get in touch, actually. But
You didn't get a chance to interview him.
no. Oh, ran out of time. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think Patrick would stick around for a bit more if you like to.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and please, I don't want to get in the way of your afternoons, but
Thank you so much.
thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.